Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Pacers Daily. I am your host, Hery Acosta. Now, today is my birthday. I was originally thinking about doing an episode where I talked about, best best Pacers players that were born on September 17th. But of course, I outside of Rasheed Wallace, who he was a Pacers rival on the Pistons, and then currently Udoka as a week, he doesn't even play right now, and just there really isn't a lot of September 17th NBA birthdays. Apparently, I thought there would be more. It's funny because every other sport has a really good player born on September 17th. Football has Patrick Mahomes, had birthday Patrick Mahomes. Hockey has Alexander Ovechkin. Racing has Jimmy Johnson. This is some big names born on September 17th. But for some reason, basketball's biggest name is Rasheed Wallace, which is still pretty big. I mean, he was a good player. But I kind of just had to go around it just because, I can't, make a whole video out of Pacers players born on September 17th, which I already knew that was going to be a kind of a crazy, you know, topic, but I just thought it'd be fun. But instead, let's just kind of talk about a little bit of trades and then just kind of start things off slowly with Reggie Miller. There's some comments he was making about how he doesn't like the fact that he can't control outcome of games anymore as a Pacers player, just like he used to whenever he was actually playing for the Pacers. Which obviously it makes sense, but he as an announcer, he actually does a really good job of kind of keeping any bias away from the media. Like, we all know he's a Pacers guy because this city has murals, everything built for him, just because he was the best Pacers player of all time. We never know, Halliburton could surpass him at some point. He's already at a pretty good trajectory. One game away from the NBA Finals. He put himself at a pretty good spot. But as of right now, Reggie Miller's still the king of the Pacers. And I completely get where he's coming from. But it's always interesting to see analysts. Like, we see players become analysts and then they have to pretend like they don't root for one team, which I absolutely respect because obviously I'm a Pacers fan. And if I'm an analyst on TV, I'm not going to show my bias. Obviously, on this channel, I will, because this channel is all about Pacers and all about just what's going on with Indy. But actually, on TV, or, kind of if you're on First Take or anything like that, you got to keep that bias out. So, I do like the comments. But next and foremost, we're going to start talking about some centers that are going to be big trade targets this year that Indy could go for any one of them. Now, believe it or not, this is actually my number one. Just because I don't think Walker Kessler, I think you have to give up way too much for Walker Kessler. Nick Richards, though, he got traded away from Charlotte to not be Mark Williams' backup. And then Phoenix trades for Mark Williams, so now Nick Richards is going to be Mark Williams' backup again. And Nick Richards is a guy that can start in the NBA. He could start on the Pacers. He's a big body, guy that can grab a bunch of rebounds, a guy that can block shots. Not the best shot blocker of the three, obviously that's Kessler, but still a guy who can get you blocks here and there. And he's a good paint scorer. Now, he's a traditional center, which I'm a big fan of. Obviously, he doesn't space the floor as much as someone like Vucevic does, but definitely someone that can go in and grab you a 10-10 game on a nightly basis if he's a starter, and then get you 8-6, 8-7 off the bench. So he's definitely someone to look for. I would be very intrigued to see what we'd give up for him, just because his value is not as high as someone like Mark Williams, and even Mark Williams' value wasn't that high at the draft. Suns basically stole him from the Hornets, but just a second round pick, maybe one of our kind of end of rotation guys for Richards, maybe a Tony Bradley. And you could probably get him for that. But next is a former All-Star who, one of the not many, but one of the few players in the NBA history of over 10,000 rebounds, which is funny because he's not even that crazy of a rebounder. Now, yeah, I've seen games where he's gotten over 20, and he's been pretty consistent around 10 rebounds a game. But if you talk about Vucevic, you don't really mention his rebounding. You mention how consistent of a shooter he is, because he's a very good 3-point shooter. He is good in the paint. He is a good offensive rebounder as well. So that is something that the Pacers could utilize, just because we've struggled with offensive rebounds for God knows how long, ever since we traded away Sabonis. But bringing in Vucevic is a little bit of a weird one, just because his value has gone down since he got to Chicago. But now that Chicago's kind of completely all over the place, and they just recently traded Levine and DeMar both to Sacramento, and now their team consists of a bunch of, good role players. Your Zach Collins, your Jalen Smiths, just a bunch of players that they've picked up over the last 2 years. The only big pieces that they kept are really Kobe White and Josh Giddey, outside of Vucevic. Congrats to Giddey on that huge contract, though. About time that they did that to him. But them trading Caruso to Oklahoma and him winning a championship right away. So just this kind of stuff that Chicago doesn't really need. But bringing in Vucevic wouldn't be awful. Now I feel like he'd be a little bit. I have to give up a little bit more than Richards, but still nothing crazy. But last but not least, let's talk about the guy who you would absolutely have to give up pretty much a first round pick and some stuff for, and that's Walker Kessler. And it's understandable. Walker Kessler's the youngest of the three. He's only been in the league a few years. He has proved that he is a great player. Now, Kessler would be a better fit on a team like the Lakers or something like that, but I wouldn't mind seeing him in a Pacers uniform. Now, the reason I put him at the end is because I feel like he's the least likely to be traded to Indy out of these three, just because I don't know if Indy's trying to give up a lot of capital for a player like Kessler. Now, if they went out and grabbed an already proven star for a lot of capital, that's one thing, what they did with Siakam. But for Kessler, maybe they want to see him prove a little bit more before the trade deadline if they do want to pull something off for him. Maybe him close to an all-star season. But obviously the Jazz have a lot of issues. The Jazz had a lot of injury problems last year. They just had, also the problem of not being a good basketball team. One of the worst teams in the NBA last year, and honestly, they didn't make really many moves. Drafting a guy that didn't even want to be on your team in the first place, 5th overall, how far is that going to take you? But they do have a young roster. Don't know how much they'd be wanting to get rid of Kessler or even Markkanen, which I could talk about Markkanen in some other episode, which I've talked about him before, but he is actually a very legit candidate to be traded to the Pacers. But kind of like Kessler, a lot of capital would have to go into that. But also the Jazz recently traded away Colin Sexton for Yusuf Nurkic. So I don't know. There's a lot going on there. But as always, like and subscribe. I am your host, Hery Acosta. This is Pacers Daily. Boom, baby, and go Sirs.